Episode 1. The Disappearance. The night settled over the city with a heavy stillness as the young art student made her way home, unaware that the final moments of her routine would become the first thread in a far darker tapestry. She'd spent the evening at a small gathering hosted by fellow students, discussing upcoming exhibitions and assignments, leaving shortly after midnight with the intention of returning to her apartment to finish a sculpture she had been obsessing over for days. Her car was found hours later on a quiet residential street, the engine still warm, the driver's door slightly ajar, and her bag placed neatly on the passenger seat, as if she had stepped out only for a moment. A faint trace of perfume lingered inside, mingling with the scent of the vehicle's old upholstery, creating an unsettling impression of a life abruptly paused. Detectives arriving at the scene noted the absence of any physical struggle. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, and no belongings scattered in panic. The only anomaly was the small metal token left on the seat, shaped like a circle with intricate geometric patterns etched into its surface. It was heavier than expected, cold to the touch, and carried no obvious markings that might connect it to a known group or symbol. The casting style suggested it had been handmade, perhaps crafted by someone with specialized metalworking knowledge. This object became the focal point of the initial investigation, raising more questions than it answered. Witnesses offered fragmented observations. One resident claimed to have heard the hum of a car idling for several minutes, but dismissed it as a passing vehicle. Another reported seeing a dark sedan parked near the intersection earlier that night, its headlights turned off despite the late hour. A jogger thought he had seen someone standing by the missing woman's car, but he could not describe the figure clearly, recalling only a silhouette and the impression that the person turned away when he approached. Each account added something but clarified nothing, creating a haze of uncertainty around the timeline of events. When detectives dug into her background, they found no history of conflict, debt, or dangerous acquaintances. She was dedicated to her art, maintained close ties with friends and family, and lived a life that seemed insulated from the shadows of the city. Yet her disappearance did not feel random. Over the past 4 months, 3 other individuals had vanished under similarly quiet circumstances. Each case included the same eerie detail, a metal token left behind as the only trace. Although the victims appeared unrelated in age, occupation, and lifestyle, the pattern was too deliberate to ignore. The earlier cases had been investigated separately, but now the parallels drew the attention of the Department's Major Crimes Division. As the team reviewed evidence from the previous incidents, a disturbing trend emerged. All victims had disappeared late at night, usually within walking distance of their homes or vehicles. None of them had called for help, suggesting the initial contact may not have seemed threatening. The lack of struggle in every case hinted at either a rapid incapacitation or a voluntary interaction that turned dangerous without warning. The metal tokens, identical in design and weight, were the only consistent marker left behind, as if the perpetrator or group responsible wanted to signal their presence without revealing their identity. Forensics examined the token found in the student's car, searching for fingerprints, chemical residues, or hidden compartments. It yielded nothing. The surface had been polished to remove any trace of handling, and the material composition appeared to be a custom alloy, not commonly used in mass manufacturing. The absence of manufacturing identifiers suggested the tokens were produced in small quantities, perhaps by a single artisan or a group with access to specialized equipment. Investigators theorized that the tokens might represent a calling card, a ritualistic element, or a method of communication within a clandestine system. The student's apartment offered little insight. Her projects were left unfinished on the work table, brushes still damp from earlier use. Her schedule listed exhibitions she planned to attend, deadlines she intended to meet, and notes about pieces she wished to create. Everything suggested a life in forward motion, without any sign she intended to leave or withdraw from her routine. Friends described her as focused, optimistic, and disciplined, making her sudden disappearance all the more perplexing. By the end of the first day, detectives recognized that they were dealing with something far more complex than a simple missing persons case. The connection to the previous disappearances deepened the urgency, and the city quietly braced for the possibility that an organized and highly calculated presence was operating in the shadows. As night fell again, the unanswered questions grew heavier, settling over the investigation like a silent weight that no one could yet decipher. Episode 2: Whispers in the Shadows. The investigation widened as detectives began tracing the origins of the strange metal token, but every lead dissolved into uncertainty the moment they tried to pursue it. The first attempts to identify the symbol led them to a handful of obscure references buried in archived police reports, each mentioning coded chatter linked to hidden markets and unregulated exchanges operating beneath the surface of the city. These reports described transactions conducted through intermediaries, encrypted messages, and anonymous deliveries made at night in places where surveillance rarely functioned. Although none of the documents explicitly referenced the token, the stylistic similarities between the geometric patterns and symbols noted in the reports suggested an older, more deeply rooted network at work. Anonymous messages began arriving at the department in the days following the student's disappearance. Some came through public tip lines, others through untraceable phone calls distorted by static. Each message carried the same warning: stop digging. The warnings were delivered calmly, without emotion, as though the callers were stating a simple fact rather than issuing a threat. One of the messages referenced the token directly, describing it as a sign that the victim had been claimed, though no further explanation was offered. Detectives understood immediately that whoever the callers were, they knew more about the case than they should. Their knowledge implied surveillance, planning, and an awareness of investigative procedures that could only belong to individuals deeply embedded in the city's undercurrents. The investigation shifted focus when an elderly journalist reached out after recognizing the details of the token from an article he had attempted to publish over a decade earlier. His files, stored in boxes in his attic, contained a series of drafts detailing his research into disappearances that resembled the current cases. He had documented witnesses who spoke of groups operating under strict hierarchies, exchanging forbidden materials, and conducting clandestine gatherings in abandoned industrial zones. He recalled receiving threatening letters at the time, some containing photographs of his family taken without his knowledge. The fear pushed him into retirement, but the resurfacing of the same symbol convinced him that the network he once wrote about had never truly disappeared. Detectives reviewed his notes carefully, discovering that several of the informants he had interviewed had also vanished within months of speaking with him. The journalist had circled a handful of addresses tied to hidden meeting points, each of them now demolished or repurposed, yet the pattern of movement revealed a consistent migration toward the city's outskirts. His files included grainy photographs of unidentified individuals wearing plain clothing, their faces obscured, entering buildings late at night through unmarked doors. Though none of these images provided definitive proof of criminal activity, the collective documentation pointed toward a long-standing, organized structure operating just out of sight. Within the police department itself, strange disruptions began occurring. Surveillance footage related to the investigation vanished from evidence rooms without any sign of forced entry or tampering. A backup drive containing early suspect lists was found corrupted beyond recovery. Detectives who requested specific records discovered that certain archives had been misfiled or removed entirely. These internal setbacks created tension and suspicion, suggesting that someone within the department either opposed the investigation or was actively assisting the underground network by obstructing progress. The team began sharing information only face-to-face, limiting documentation and reducing digital trails. As the search for answers deepened, the detectives found themselves navigating a web of cryptic symbols sprayed in alleyways and underpasses across the city. Some of the markings matched the geometric style of the token, though the variations implied different meanings or hierarchical distinctions. Graffiti artists interviewed by the task force claimed they had not seen these markings before and would have avoided replicating them even if they had. explaining that some symbols were considered off-limits within street culture due to rumors of violent retaliation from groups who claimed ownership of them. In the midst of these discoveries, fragments of new evidence emerged from unrelated investigations. A weapons seizure months earlier had included a lockbox containing an identical metal token, though the officer who logged the evidence had dismissed it as a trinket. Another case involving counterfeit documents had referenced an unknown buyer insisting on meeting in remote locations, leaving behind the same type of cold, polished token as payment. Though these incidents had never been connected before, each now added another layer to the growing realization that the disappearances were only one part of a much broader structure. The detectives' sense of unease grew heavier as they pieced together the implications of the mounting clues. The shadows surrounding the case felt alive, as though they were being watched from corners that light no longer reached. Every detail pointed toward an entity that had existed for much longer than anyone realized, evolving silently while maintaining strict secrecy. The city that appeared bustling and ordinary by day concealed a hidden system that operated by night, governed by rules no outsider had ever fully understood. As the detectives pressed forward, the warnings and disruptions only strengthened their resolve to uncover the truth. Even as they stepped further into a labyrinth from which no clear path back seemed to exist. Episode 3: The Hidden Rooms. The tip that arrived early in the morning led detectives to the outskirts of the city, where old industrial buildings stood abandoned like remnants of a forgotten era. The informant, whose identity remained concealed even from the officers handling the message, claimed that one of these structures housed evidence connected to the recent disappearances. The building in question had once been a textile factory, later used for storage, and finally left to decay after a series of code violations forced its closure. Ivy crawled up its cracked concrete walls, and rusted metal beams framed the broken windows like the skeleton of a long-dead creature. The silence surrounding it felt unnaturally dense, amplifying every step taken across the gravel-strewn lot. Inside, the air carried the sharp scent of dust and chemicals. Faded machinery stood motionless under layers of grime, their belts stiff from disuse. Investigators proceeded with caution, flashlights cutting through the murky interior as they navigated the maze of corridors. Most rooms appeared empty, except for scattered debris and remnants of old paperwork, but a section near the back of the building drew immediate attention. A large metal door had been welded shut, yet its surface showed signs of recent use. Someone had forced it open from the inside, leaving faint scratches and metal shavings scattered on the floor. The door led to a narrow staircase descending into darkness. At the bottom of the staircase, the detectives found a series of hidden chambers that did not appear in any blueprint or historical record. The first room contained several metal tables arranged in organized rows. The tables were stained, though the substances could not be immediately identified. Along the walls stood shelves filled with jars, each containing powders and liquids labeled with symbols instead of words. Old surgical tools lay scattered across the surfaces, some gleaming clean, while others showed flecks of rust. The presence of halogen lamps attached to portable power units indicated recent activity, despite the building having been officially abandoned for years. Farther in, another chamber revealed an even more disturbing sight. Several heavy restraints were bolted into the concrete floor, with chains extending toward support beams overhead. The area around the restraints bore markings suggesting prolonged use. Investigators collected samples while maintaining silence, each person processing the implications of what they were uncovering. A cluster of forged identification documents lay stacked on a small table in the corner, organized into folders marked by color-coded tabs. Each folder contained photographs, false names, and detailed personal profiles. Some of the faces matched missing persons cases spanning years, as though the individuals who vanished had passed through these rooms before disappearing entirely. The third chamber offered clues in a different form. Boxes, filled with cassette tapes labeled only with dates, sat neatly arranged against one wall. The tapes, when briefly examined, contained muffled background sounds and indistinct voices, though no one could determine the purpose of the recordings. Several maps, pinned to corkboards, displayed routes across the city marked with colored strings, connecting residential districts, industrial areas, and known transit points. Some routes were drawn in looping patterns that repeated across multiple maps, hinting at recurring paths or operations that required precise coordination. A final room contained a furnace-like structure, though it had been heavily modified. Its interior showed signs of intense heat, with charred residue clinging to the metal lining. Investigators speculated that this chamber might have been used to destroy evidence, though no definitive conclusions could be made on site. The atmosphere in this room felt particularly suffocating, as though the walls themselves held the remnants of past horrors. During the sweep of the underground space, detectives noted an unsettling consistency. Every room appeared to have been abandoned abruptly. Tools were left mid-task, documents sat open, lamps remained plugged into portable generators, and personal belongings, such as gloves and water bottles, were scattered carelessly. It looked as though whoever occupied the chambers had fled after receiving a sudden warning. Footprints in the dust suggested multiple individuals had passed through the rooms in haste, some moving toward what appeared to be an alternative exit, not yet located by investigators. When examining the doorway behind the last chamber, officers discovered a partially concealed tunnel, sealed with a makeshift barricade of wooden boards and metal scraps. The boards were recently cut, and the nails securing them showed no signs of corrosion, indicating they had been installed only days earlier. Beyond the barricade, a faint draft suggested additional passageways, though further exploration was postponed until structural engineers could assess the tunnel for safety. Despite this limitation, the mere presence of a hidden exit suggested the underground group had constructed an escape route designed to evade detection should their base ever be compromised. As evidence began to accumulate, a clearer picture formed of a carefully structured operation that had existed far longer than previously suspected. The hidden rooms demonstrated expertise in forgery, surveillance, medical procedures, and logistical planning. Records implied that dozens of individuals had passed through the chambers over the years, some willingly, others forced. The scale of the operation exceeded anything the detectives had encountered before, revealing an organization capable of erasing identities, manipulating information, and disposing of anything that might jeopardize its secrecy. The discovery of the hidden rooms marked a significant shift in the investigation, transforming speculation into tangible proof that a sophisticated underground network was orchestrating the disappearances. Each artifact collected, each room documented, and each clue analyzed contributed to an expanding understanding of a threat deeply embedded within the city's forgotten spaces, operating silently beneath the lives of those who never suspected its presence. Episode 4: Blood on the Streets. The discovery of the hidden rooms ignited an unsettling shift throughout the city, as though a silent signal had been sent to those lurking within its darker corners. Within days, incidents of violence erupted with a precision that felt coordinated. The first act occurred at midday, on a crowded street where two individuals known to law enforcement as intermediaries in illegal trades were shot with unnerving accuracy. Witnesses described the assailant only as a masked figure moving with deliberate calmness, disappearing into an alley before the shock of the attack fully reached the crowd. The killings bore none of the typical hallmarks of gang conflict or personal vendettas. Instead, the execution-style precision suggested a message delivered with deadly clarity. In the aftermath, detectives scoured the scene, gathering shell casings and examining surveillance footage. Yet every nearby camera either malfunctioned at the exact moment of the shooting or recorded only static. Technicians confirmed that the disruptions were not accidental. Someone had overridden the systems. This level of interference indicated access to specialized equipment and knowledge beyond that of typical street criminals. As officers examined the victims' backgrounds, they found faint connections to the forged documents discovered in the hidden chambers. Despite being minor players, the two men had occasionally served as couriers within a shadowy network operating behind legitimate fronts. making them potential liabilities to whoever controlled the underground organization. Graffiti began appearing across the city in rapid bursts of activity, marking walls, alleyways, and abandoned structures with symbols matching the geometric patterns engraved on the metal tokens. While the meaning of each symbol remained ambiguous, their sudden proliferation created a climate of fear, signaling that the underground network was asserting dominance. Some symbols were placed deliberately over existing gang tags, an unmistakable sign of territorial takeover. Residents who lived near these markings reported hearing vehicles arriving late at night, engines idling briefly before disappearing into the darkness. Others claimed unfamiliar individuals loitered near the graffiti, observing the streets with silent vigilance. As violence surged, the streets became fraught with tension. Ambulance sirens echoed through the night, responding to stabbings, disappearances, and unexplained assaults. In several cases, victims who survived reported being warned not to speak about what they had seen. Their descriptions of the perpetrators were vague and inconsistent, as though the attackers had intentionally concealed their identities through disguises, shadows, or blinding lights. Some victims spoke of a cold metallic emblem pressed against their skin before being released, though none could explain its significance. Detectives noted that similar accounts had surfaced in years past, buried within older case files dismissed as unrelated incidents. The established criminal organizations that once dominated the city's illicit activities reacted with unexpected apprehension. Informants who had previously boasted about their connections now refused to speak, claiming that a new presence had emerged, one operating with a level of ruthlessness and discipline they had never encountered. Long-standing gangs began withdrawing from certain districts, abandoning lucrative territories without resistance. The sudden power vacuum in these areas created confusion among patrol units, who expected violence but instead witnessed an eerie calm. The retreat suggested that these groups feared something far more dangerous than rival factions. Detectives attempting to trace the origins of the new violence encountered numerous obstacles. Individuals who might have provided valuable insight either disappeared, refused to cooperate, or reported being followed by vehicles with tinted windows. One officer noticed the same unmarked sedan parked near his home on consecutive nights, though it vanished before he could record its license plate. Others reported their homes being searched with unsettling precision, nothing stolen yet objects subtly repositioned, indicating someone had been inside. This pattern of intimidation demonstrated that the underground network possessed both intelligence capabilities and an awareness of the investigation's inner workings. As the days progressed, forensic experts connected a set of fingerprints found on a discarded glove at a crime scene to a suspect presumed dead years earlier. His supposed death, documented in an explosion linked to an illegal manufacturing operation, now appeared questionable. Records surrounding the incident were incomplete, and several key documents had been sealed under unexplained circumstances. Detectives realized that the underground network was capable not only of orchestrating disappearances, but also of fabricating deaths, resurrecting individuals with new identities while erasing their pasts. Another significant lead emerged when patrol officers discovered a body in an alley behind a closed market. The victim had been left in a carefully positioned posture, with a metal token placed neatly on his chest. Unlike the previous tokens associated with disappearances, this one bore a different set of engravings, more angular, with intersecting lines suggesting a ranking system or internal designation. The victim, identified as a known trafficker, had recently attempted to branch out independently from established networks. His death, marked with such precision, resembled an execution carried out for violating unwritten rules. City officials struggled to address the rising tension. Press conferences offered reassurances, yet the public sensed the growing instability beneath the polished statements. Nighttime activity declined as residents chose caution over routine. Every street corner, every shadowed alley seemed charged with lingering menace. Rumors circulated of vehicles moving silently through the outskirts, headlights extinguished, transporting individuals whose identities remained unknown. The number of missing persons rose, though many cases went unreported due to fear or distrust of authority. Within the police department, the task force monitoring the case felt the pressure mounting. Evidence pointed to an entity operating with military-like structure, capable of rapid violence, strategic communication, and infiltration across multiple sectors of the city. Each new incident suggested that the underground network was not reacting defensively, but instead asserting dominance, eliminating threats, and establishing new lines of control. The bloodshed that spread across the streets was not random chaos, but a calculated display of power intended to shape the city's underworld, according to its own concealed order. The investigation became a race against an adversary that moved without hesitation, leaving behind only fragments of clues and the chilling certainty that the violence was far from reaching its peak. Episode 5. The Informant. The growing wave of violence pushed the investigation into a direction no one had anticipated, and the detectives found themselves navigating a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Just as they began to suspect that the underground network had no vulnerabilities, an unexpected message reached the task force through an encrypted channel used only for internal communication. The message contained no signature, no identifying metadata, and no traceable routing information. It held a single statement claiming that the sender had previously worked for the clandestine organization believed to be responsible for the disappearances, executions, and territorial dominance spreading through the city. The message instructed detectives to meet at a prearranged location at a specific time, warning them to come without surveillance equipment or backup if they wanted the truth. The location was an abandoned community center on the fringes of the city, once used for youth programs before financial cuts forced its closure. The building stood half-collapsed, with graffiti covering its walls and floors warped by water damage. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and dust, and the silence resonated with the weight of forgotten activity. The detectives searched the perimeter carefully, expecting an ambush, yet the building remained empty until a subtle shift in the shadows revealed a lone figure waiting near the collapsed stage. His posture carried neither aggression nor desperation, but rather the cautious tension of someone hunted by multiple threats. The informant refused to step into the light, remaining partially obscured by broken beams and scattered debris. Although his exact features remained indistinguishable, his movements suggested significant physical strain, as though he had been running or hiding for an extended period. He spoke slowly, offering fragments of information that coalesced into a portrait of an organization far more structured than anyone had imagined. According to him, the underground group operated under a rigid hierarchy known internally as the Chamber. This network functioned like an unseen authority, distributing orders through coded symbols, encrypted messages, and intermediaries who rarely knew the identities of those above them. The Chamber's influence extended across numerous sectors: trafficking, forgery, surveillance, political leverage, and contract eliminations. He claimed the metal tokens found at multiple crime scenes served as internal markers, signaling completed tasks, issued warnings, or territorial claims. Each engraving represented a specific directive, and the pattern was understood only by those initiated into the organization's upper tiers. Lower-level operatives interacted through strict compartmentalization, ensuring no individual possessed enough knowledge to expose the entire network. The informant explained that the symbols painted across the city were not random displays of power, but coded messages communicating territorial boundaries, internal disputes, or instructions for planned operations. As the informant continued, detectives realized he had been involved in logistics, coordinating the movement of individuals through hidden routes, including tunnels and abandoned buildings. He had been responsible for scheduling shipments, transporting certain victims, and assisting in the erasure of identities for individuals being absorbed into the organization. His detailed descriptions of the hidden chambers aligned with what investigators had discovered, confirming that those rooms had been used as processing stations for years. According to him, each victim followed a predetermined path based on their value to the organization. Some were used for leverage against influential figures, others for information extraction, and some simply disappeared when they became inconvenient. The informant insisted that the Chamber's power came not from sheer numbers, but from its ability to infiltrate legitimate institutions through corruption and blackmail. He described officers compromised through bribes, politicians coerced into compliance, and business leaders manipulated through hidden debts. The organization's survival depended on its ability to map the vulnerabilities of those in positions of influence, exploiting them to ensure protection and secrecy. The informant claimed that he chose to defect only because he had witnessed an operation involving a young woman whose disappearance triggered his conscience. Although he never saw her harmed, he believed she was being prepared for transfer to one of the organization's most secure locations, known only through whispered references as the Lattice. While his account unraveled several mysteries, it raised new concerns about the organization's reach. He warned that the recent acts of violence were not reactions to the investigation, but part of a planned restructuring meant to eliminate unreliable intermediaries and consolidate control. The killings of the two smugglers, the execution marked with a uniquely engraved token, and the overnight appearance of symbols across the city were all strategic maneuvers designed to send messages internally and externally. According to him, the Chamber viewed the discovery of the hidden rooms as a calculated risk rather than a catastrophic breach. They had abandoned those chambers intentionally, using them as a decoy while they redirected operations into deeper, more secure environments. The informant's voice began to shake as he confessed that he feared he had been tracked. He described seeing the same vehicle near different hiding locations, receiving coded warnings left inside abandoned properties where he slept, and sensing the presence of watchers who never revealed themselves. Every detail he provided pointed to an organization capable of monitoring defectors with alarming accuracy, ensuring that no one who attempted to escape would remain free for long. He admitted that he had sustained injuries in a recent confrontation, though he refused medical assistance, insisting that anyone who treated him would become a target. He ended his account by providing a set of locations marked on a worn piece of paper, each corresponding to places he claimed were used by the organization for storage, meetings, or temporary holding. He urged detectives to move quickly, stating that the Chamber adapted faster than any law enforcement group could anticipate. With that final warning, he retreated into the shadows, refusing to allow the detectives to follow. Within moments, he disappeared into the maze of surrounding alleys, leaving behind only the damp paper and the echo of his unsteady footsteps fading into the night. The detectives secured the document and prepared to investigate the marked locations, knowing that the information they had received offered the clearest map yet into the elusive structure of the underground network operating beneath the city. Chapter 6. The Circle Narrows. The task force spent the following days piecing together every fragment of information gathered from the abandoned workshop, and each detail began to form the outline of a structure far more complex than anyone had initially imagined. The symbols discovered on the crates were matched to an old registry kept by a defunct import firm that had once operated quietly under a network of shell companies. The firm had dissolved more than 2 decades earlier, yet its markings continued appearing in hidden caches scattered across the edges of the country. The implication was that the operation had never truly ended, only dissolved into the shadows and continued under new leadership. Files retrieved from archival storage slowly revealed a chain of disappearances linked to individuals who had conducted audits or investigations into the firm's questionable activities. None of those cases had ever been resolved, and the pattern created an unbroken thread stretching from the past into the present. The notes discovered in the workshop offered additional layers of complexity. Written in coded shorthand, they referenced shipments described using innocuous terminology. But cross-analysis showed that the dates aligned with known incidents involving untraceable chemical compounds. Experts brought into the task force identified these compounds as precursors for creating toxins, with effects subtle enough to avoid detection during initial examinations. The handwriting on the notes matched samples found in university records tied to a former chemistry professor whose resignation had followed an unresolved ethics scandal. His last recorded address had been abandoned for many years, and any attempt to locate him led only to disconnected numbers and empty buildings. Yet the frequency with which his name appeared in the coded papers suggested that he had been more than a consultant. He had likely been one of the architects of the Operation S inner workings. Investigators also uncovered traces of soil embedded in the machinery retrieved from the workshop. Laboratory analysis showed that the soil composition didn't correspond to the surrounding area, indicating that the equipment had been relocated from another site. When specialists narrowed down the geographical match, the results pointed toward a rural region known for its broad, undeveloped fields and a scattering of industrial ruins left behind after a series of bankruptcies. The presence of that particular soil hinted that the operation maintained multiple locations, each serving a specific function within a larger covert network. Surveillance teams were dispatched to examine these areas, but the landscape proved too wide and too silent, revealing only remnants of structures long since reclaimed by overgrowth. Digital forensics provided one of the rare breakthroughs. A corrupted hard drive recovered from the workshop was restored fragment by fragment until a cluster of hidden directories emerged. Within them were financial ledgers recorded in cipher, revealing transactions that had moved funds across borders through intermediaries with no apparent ties to the original shell company. What stood out was the consistency in the amounts transferred. Each sum was repeated exactly every 4 months, directed toward an unnamed beneficiary, identified only by an encrypted signature. Experts concluded that the regularity of the payments indicated a retainer, suggesting that someone with specialized knowledge was being compensated to maintain the System S secrecy. Tracing the origin of these payments revealed an elaborate structure designed to obscure accountability, using outdated banking routes and accounts opened under identities impossible to verify. The complexity of the system implied a level of sophistication, pointing to individuals highly trained in financial deception. Meanwhile, the task force followed leads obtained from the recovered blueprints. Details on the margins referenced older architectural designs used in facilities intended for manufacturing rather than storage. When these details were compared to national archives, investigators discovered that the designs originated from a building commissioned more than 4 decades earlier by an engineering firm that had since vanished from public records. Rumors surrounding the firm's dissolution involved sudden closures, missing staff, and confidential inquiries that had never reached the public. Despite the lack of formal documentation, surviving employees contacted anonymously recalled unusual projects involving large-scale ventilation systems and reinforced underground structures. None of them could remember the intended purpose of the facility, and each insisted that the project had been abruptly terminated without explanation. The deeper the task force dug, the more apparent it became that each piece of evidence was part of a puzzle intentionally fragmented across time and geography. Even the chemicals found in the workshop matched substances listed in environmental reports filed more than 3 decades earlier after unexplained contamination events. These incidents had quietly faded from public attention, buried beneath bureaucratic language and technical jargon. Yet when the data was examined as a whole, it wove a narrative of long-term experimentation and clandestine distribution channels, sustaining themselves through silence and obscurity. The cumulative weight of these findings narrowed the list of suspects to a small circle of individuals who had remained active in specialized fields despite the passage of years. Each name evoked a history of sudden career shifts, unexplained absences, or forced resignations that aligned with moments when the covert network had changed direction. With the circle tightening, the task force prepared to examine the remaining anomalies uncovered in the records. The incomplete map found in the workshop showed several marked locations along a route that investigators had not yet deciphered. It bore no resemblance to transportation lines or geographical boundaries, but when analysts compared it against historical land acquisition documents, the symbols corresponded to properties purchased by obscure corporations during a brief window spanning less than 1 year. These properties shared a pattern. Each contained subterranean structures originally used for storage or transport, and each had been sold at a loss shortly after acquisition. The frequency of these transactions indicated deliberate attempts to control and then abandon specific underground access points, suggesting that the network had relocated its core operations multiple times to avoid detection. As the task force prepared to cross-reference the latest findings, tensions rose within the investigative team. The evidence had ceased pointing toward isolated incidents and instead indicated a coherent system sustained over decades by experts who understood how to manipulate bureaucratic blind spots. The emerging pattern demonstrated a level of planning that had allowed the organization to remain untouched despite previous investigations that had come close to exposing its activities. The investigators were left with the understanding that the closer they approached the Operation S inner circle, the more carefully concealed the remaining evidence would be. Chapter 7. The Vanishing Trail. The narrowing circle of suspects brought a new intensity to the investigation. Yet the task force found itself navigating a labyrinth of decoys designed to obscure the truth. As analysts assembled timelines for each person of interest, inconsistencies emerged in their professional histories. Months were unaccounted for, employment records contained suspicious gaps, and several individuals lacked documentation corresponding to periods when the covert operation had undergone major transitions. The missing intervals aligned too consistently to be dismissed as coincidence. When investigators examined relocation records, they discovered that multiple suspects had moved residences within the same short span of years, and each move corresponded to a documented shift in the concealed Network S activities. The repetition of these patterns implied deliberate attempts to erase their tracks, replacing verifiable history with manufactured traces. Further complicating the investigation were reports obtained from regional archives detailing unexplained shutdowns of small research facilities. Although none of the records named the suspects directly, each closure coincided with the presence of personnel whose backgrounds overlapped with the fields connected to the Operation S technical core. Scientists, engineers, and logisticians had appeared briefly in these locations before vanishing from public records entirely. Many of them were believed to have resigned voluntarily, yet the dates of their departures aligned almost perfectly with the clandestine Network S periods of reorganization. The task force identified a subset of these individuals who shared institutional ties with the former chemistry professor whose coded notes had been found in the workshop. Their collective disappearance suggested a coordinated extraction rather than isolated resignations. The financial investigation deepened as forensic accountants reconstructed the encrypted ledgers. New patterns surfaced involving dormant accounts that had become active for brief intervals before being sealed again. Each activation involved the transfer of precise amounts, repeated at regular intervals, mirroring the payment structure previously uncovered. Cross-referencing these movements with airline itineraries, passport records, and corporate filings revealed that the transfers coincided with the international travel of a single unidentified coordinator. The individual used a series of aliases, each constructed from partial identities pieced together from outdated records belonging to deceased or missing persons. The complexity of the method indicated an advanced understanding of identity fraud and suggested that the coordinator operated as the Network S logistical backbone, ensuring continuity across borders and decades. Investigators turned their attention to the abandoned properties linked by the incomplete map. A team surveyed one of the subterranean sites, discovering structural modifications inconsistent with the building's original design. Engineers determined that the ventilation systems had been reinforced to accommodate long-term occupation, and several chambers had been lined with materials designed to prevent electromagnetic signals from escaping. These modifications suggested that the underground site had once housed sensitive equipment, requiring protection from detection. Although the rooms appeared empty, chemical residue was found in one of the sealed compartments, matching compounds listed in older environmental contamination reports. The persistence of these residues indicated that the site had been active long after the surrounding property had fallen into disuse. Additional evidence surfaced when a retired facilities inspector contacted the task force after recognizing a symbol from a televised briefing. He recalled encountering the symbol more than 3 decades earlier in a storage unit located behind a series of decommissioned industrial plants. According to his testimony, the unit had contained machinery resembling the equipment discovered in the workshop. He had reported the anomaly at the time, but the complaint had been dismissed due to jurisdictional confusion created by overlapping property claims. The inspector noted that shortly after filing his report, the unit had been emptied and sealed, with all records of its previous contents removed from local archives. This recollection provided a temporal anchor, confirming that the network had operated continuously since at least that period, adjusting its tactics to exploit bureaucratic weakness. An important breakthrough emerged when researchers examined the metadata embedded in the recovered blueprints. Hidden within the file were fragments of coordinates referencing multiple regions, each corresponding to locations historically associated with unexplained industrial activity. The coordinates formed a grid that matched the layout of underground tunnels once used for transportation during the expansion of mid-century infrastructure projects. Many of these tunnels had never been fully documented, and several had been sealed after construction due to safety concerns. However, satellite imaging revealed subtle disturbances in the terrain above them, indicating that portions had been reopened or modified in recent years. The presence of these tunnels linked several abandoned sites to one another, suggesting that the covert network had developed a subterranean route that allowed for movement between locations without detection. The task force analyzed the access points along this route, identifying structural patterns shared by properties acquired during the brief period noted in the acquisition files. These properties contained concealed entryways, masked by legitimate architectural features such as storage basements, service corridors, or maintenance shafts. Many of the buildings had been sold to private buyers who remained unaware of the additional structures hidden beneath them. One such property, a former distribution facility, was found to contain a reinforced elevator shaft leading to a sealed level beneath the basement. Although the chamber was empty, markings on the walls matched those seen in the workshop, confirming its use as part of the network's operational cycle. Despite the growing clarity of the network structure, the individuals responsible remained elusive. Surveillance efforts directed toward the limited circle of suspects yielded little movement, as each one maintained an outwardly mundane lifestyle designed to deflect attention. Their financial records showed no irregularities, and their communications appeared routine. The task force began to suspect that the inner circle had established a system of coded signals embedded in seemingly ordinary transactions, using unnoticed patterns to transmit instructions. Analysts attempted to identify these signals, but the sheer volume of data made the task overwhelming. As the investigation expanded, the suspicion grew that the coordinator using the reconstructed identities still operated actively within this hidden web. As the 7th stage of the investigation unfolded, the Vanishing Trail highlighted the sophistication of the system the task force faced. Every discovery revealed another layer of concealment, and every lead dissolved into ambiguity just as it seemed within reach. Chapter 8. Shadows of the Inner Ring. The 8th phase of the investigation pushed the task force into a deeper realm of the covert network's inner mechanisms, exposing traces of coordination that had remained undetected for decades. Analysts began revisiting prior evidence with newly refined methods, recognizing that the operation functioned through a layered hierarchy in which each segment of activity concealed another beneath it. At the highest visible tier were decoy entities created to appear as the core of the operation, deliberately positioned to draw attention away from the individuals who managed the long-term continuity of the system. These entities included dissolved corporations, vacant research facilities, and abandoned subterranean sites that bore enough signs of prior use to satisfy shallow inquiries. Only upon closer scrutiny did investigators realize that these elements served as the outer shell, protecting a more intricate inner ring of participants. The task force began reconstructing the movements of individuals who had briefly appeared in archival records before disappearing. One pattern emerged involving a small group of specialists who had been employed by private consulting firms during overlapping periods. These firms had been contracted to evaluate infrastructure vulnerabilities in regions where the concealed tunnels had been discovered. Examination of their assignments revealed that the evaluations had been conducted under the guise of safety inspections, yet the reports omitted significant details regarding subterranean access points. The omission was consistent across each specialist's work, suggesting deliberate coordination rather than oversight. Although none of the specialists could be located in present-day records, their brief presence in the historical timeline hinted at their involvement in establishing or reinforcing the concealed routes. Further analysis uncovered a subset of encrypted communications buried within the corrupted hard drive. Although the contents had fragmented, metadata suggested that the messages had been transmitted using older communication protocols reliant on short-range repeaters. These protocols had once been popular among organizations requiring secure transfers that left minimal digital traces. When investigators reconstructed portions of the metadata, they discovered that the messages had originated from a cluster of locations corresponding to smaller abandoned properties listed on the incomplete map. Each message had been transmitted only once with no responsive data found. The unidirectional nature of the communications suggested that these properties functioned as distribution nodes rather than active workspaces, relaying instructions outward while remaining isolated from return traffic. The discovery led investigators to reconsider the role of the unidentified coordinator, whose travel patterns aligned with financial transfers. When analysts mapped the coordinator's movements across the timeline of abandoned properties, they found that several of the sites had been visited shortly before major shifts in the network's operational structure. These visits coincided with the sudden resignations of specialists, the shutdown of research facilities, and changes in the distribution patterns of chemical compounds linked to the contamination incidents documented in historical environmental reports. This alignment strengthened the theory that the coordinator served as a mobile architect, overseeing transitions between phases of the operation, ensuring that each segment evolved without leaving a continuous trail. The task force expanded its research into the chemical residues found at the subterranean locations. The compounds degraded at known rates, allowing specialists to estimate the last periods of activity in each chamber. These estimates revealed a rotation pattern in which sites were used for limited durations before being vacated and replaced by new ones. The rotation followed a sequence consistent with the timeline of property acquisitions documented decades earlier, suggesting that the network had planned its relocations long before implementing them. This long-term planning indicated the presence of a guiding authority capable of envisioning the operation not as a series of isolated incidents, but as an evolving system designed to withstand external pressures. When investigators returned to the coded notes discovered in the original workshop, they found that several phrases aligned with terminology used in older scientific literature, referencing early-stage development of synthetic compounds. The terminology reflected methods that had been replaced by modern techniques, implying that the notes were authored by someone who had trained in an earlier era of research. This narrowed the list of potential contributors to those with specialized backgrounds dating back several decades. By cross-referencing university archives, government research appointments, and industry records, investigators identified a cluster of individuals whose expertise matched the nature of the coded notes. Many of these individuals had disappeared from professional documentation around the same time the operation began its long-term transition into obscurity. The reconstructed grid of coordinates obtained from blueprint metadata revealed that the subterranean tunnel network extended farther than initially believed. Several access points lay beneath properties that had been renovated without knowledge of the underlying structures. A review of construction permits revealed that the same architectural consulting firm had signed off on modifications to these properties. The firm's records showed minimal staffing and sparse documentation for the renovations. Yet signatures on the permits matched names associated with historical anomalies involving untraceable personnel. The recurrence of these names indicated that the inner ring maintained influence within legitimate institutions, using their positions to preserve access to concealed infrastructure. As the task force analyzed travel data, they noticed an emerging pattern involving flights booked under identities associated with the reconstructed aliases. The destinations corresponded to cities that housed archives related to industrial development projects from more than 4 decades earlier. Each project involved materials that matched the compounds detected in the contaminated sites. These trips coincided with the periods during which the network appeared to restructure itself, suggesting that the coordinator routinely revisited historical documentation to ensure continuity within the evolving system. This practice indicated a level of discipline suggesting that the inner ring relied not only on secrecy, but also on a structured adherence to its original blueprint. Investigators also began reviewing testimonies from individuals who had contacted authorities over the years with concerns about unusual activities near abandoned properties. These reports, dismissed at the time as unrelated or unsubstantiated, contained subtle details aligning with the operation's evolving structure. One witness described hearing machinery operating beneath an empty building during the early hours of the morning. Another reported vehicles arriving and departing from a sealed loading dock long after the property had been declared vacant. Although the witnesses had no understanding of the larger context, their observations indicated that the network maintained intermittent activity cycles intended to minimize detection by relying on predictable human patterns of inattention. As evidence accumulated, a clearer picture of the inner ring began to materialize. Its members appeared to operate with disciplined precision, coordinating transitions across multiple decades while ensuring that each phase remained insulated from the next. The organization's continuity suggested the presence of a strategic doctrine designed to outlast external scrutiny by adapting to shifting environments and technological advancements. The task force, now narrowing its focus on the architects embedded within this concealed hierarchy, recognized that the operation's endurance stemmed not from chance, but from the deliberate preservation of an intricate structure operating in the shadows. Chapter 9. The structure of their silence. The widening scope of the investigation brought the task force to a pivotal stage in which the scattered fragments of evidence began forming the outline of a rigid internal architecture. This structure was not merely organizational but ideological, built upon principles that had guided the network's evolution across multiple decades. Analysts studying the encrypted communications noticed a recurring pattern in the metadata that suggested the messages followed a rotational schedule. Each sender transmitted only once, and each node passed instructions in a predefined sequence. The lack of bilateral communication revealed a command system resembling an ancient relay network in which information flowed in a single direction to prevent leaks. This design ensured that no individual outside the innermost circle possessed a complete understanding of the operation, shielding the core from infiltration or exposure. The rotation schedule mirrored the shifting timelines documented in property acquisitions and facility shutdowns. When researchers mapped the dates of construction, evacuation, and repurposing of the subterranean sites, they observed a cadence that aligned with known internal transitions of the network. Every few years, the inner ring initiated a controlled migration of its activities, abandoning certain access points while establishing new ones along the concealed tunnel routes. These migrations were executed with precision, leaving behind only faint chemical and structural traces. Specialists analyzing these remnants concluded that the transitions had been planned far in advance, with each phase designed to obscure the tracks of the previous one. The cumulative effect created layers of misdirection that forced investigators to sift through decades of deliberate obfuscation. The individuals closest to the core of the operation demonstrated an unusual uniformity in their personal histories. Each one had maintained a public facade of professional normalcy, while their underlying movements aligned with the network's structural shifts. Their travel patterns, employment changes, and educational backgrounds formed parallel arcs that converged at critical points in the operation's timeline. Analysts examining archived personnel files discovered that several members of the Inner Ring had once participated in obscure research initiatives focused on industrial byproducts and chemical stability. These projects had been terminated abruptly, and their findings had never been published. The disappearance of these researchers from public academic records coincided with the earliest known instances of the contamination reports tied to the network's activities. The coded notes found in the abandoned workshop proved instrumental in identifying additional patterns. Linguistic analysis revealed that the author used archaic scientific terminology unlikely to appear in modern research. This indicated that the conceptual framework underpinning the network's methodology originated from an earlier generation of experts who had been trained under outdated academic standards. When historians cross-reference these linguistic markers with university archives, a small list of professors and senior researchers emerged. Many of them had resigned or disappeared during a period marked by increased scrutiny of industrial laboratories. This convergence suggested that the network had absorbed individuals who feared legal consequences or professional ruin, offering them secrecy and continued avenues for their work. Meanwhile, the reconstruction of the subterranean tunnel system advanced with new detail. Using geological surveys and historical infrastructure schematics, engineers identified 3 primary corridors that connected the abandoned properties mapped in earlier phases of the investigation. These corridors were reinforced with materials designed to withstand long-term degradation, indicating substantial planning and resource allocation. Several auxiliary branches extended from these main routes, leading to sealed chambers whose purposes remained unclear. Chemical residue found in 2 of these chambers matched compounds detected in earlier contamination events, confirming that the tunnels had been used not merely for transport, but for storage and possibly experimentation. The scale of the network suggested that the Inner Ring had intended the system to serve multiple purposes, adapting its function across different eras of operation. Financial reconstruction revealed another layer of the network's architecture. Forensic accountants identified patterns in historical funding that pointed to a single origin source, disguised through a series of shell corporations. These shells emerged and dissolved rapidly during the years in which the network established its subterranean infrastructure. The funds moved in precise increments, always in the same amount, always through the same intervals. When investigators examined these transactions alongside the travel records of the unidentified coordinator, they found perfect alignment between the funding cycles and the coordinator's movement. This alignment suggested that the coordinator not only oversaw logistical transitions, but also controlled financial distribution across the Inner Ring. The discipline reflected in the financial structure further emphasized the network's reliance on consistency, precision, and silence. The testimonies collected from historical witnesses contributed subtle but important insights into the network's internal culture. Several individuals reported that the people they had encountered near abandoned properties exhibited an unusual emotional detachment. Whether moving equipment or conducting routine inspections, they displayed a calm efficiency that suggested rigorous training or conditioning. These descriptions aligned with psychological profiles developed by analysts studying long-term clandestine operations. The consistency of these accounts hinted at a unified behavioral doctrine imposed by the Inner Ring, designed to maintain secrecy through disciplined neutrality. Investigators also found evidence suggesting that the Inner Ring used environmental disruptions as cover for its activities. Historical weather anomalies, electrical outages, and local construction accidents aligned suspiciously with moments when the network relocated equipment or personnel. These disruptions masked movement within the subterranean corridors, preventing observers from noticing unusual activity. Such coordination required extensive planning and implied that the core group possessed access to predictive models or insider knowledge that allowed them to exploit natural and structural vulnerabilities. As the team revisited the incomplete map recovered from the workshop, they recognized that the symbols marking each property indicated more than simple locations. The positioning of the symbols formed a geometric pattern that matched early century structural diagrams used to optimize airflow and pressure distribution in underground facilities. When the map was overlaid with modern terrain data, analysts discovered that the marked properties formed the boundaries of a larger concealed grid. This grid appeared to serve as a stabilizing structure for the tunnels, reinforcing the system and enabling long-term use despite environmental decay. The sophistication of the design demonstrated that the inner ring possessed advanced engineering knowledge that had not been publicly documented. The investigation into communication patterns revealed another crucial aspect of the Network S structure. Each transmission captured in the recovered metadata contained timing intervals that mirrored natural fluctuations in atmospheric interference. This method allowed the inner ring to camouflage their signals within environmental noise, avoiding detection by modern surveillance systems. The precision required to implement such a technique suggested that the individuals responsible maintained a deep understanding of radio propagation and atmospheric science. The combination of engineering, chemistry, logistics, and psychology within the inner ring's framework indicated a highly interdisciplinary foundation that allowed the network to endure changes in technology and oversight. As the task force worked through these revelations, the underlying truth became increasingly clear. The Operation S longevity depended on a structure engineered not only to function in secrecy, but to evolve with time. The layered silence embedded within each tier of the hierarchy ensured that even if one segment were exposed, the core would remain insulated and operational. Chapter 10. The Final Reckoning. The culmination of years of investigation brought the task force to a threshold that few had anticipated, where every fragment of evidence pointed to a meticulously orchestrated conclusion. By now, the inner workings of the network had been mapped with unprecedented clarity, revealing a structure capable of surviving decades of scrutiny. The subterranean corridors, abandoned properties, and encrypted communications formed a lattice of operations that allowed the organization to function continuously, despite the interventions of authorities, technological advances, and natural decay. The network had adapted, evolving its methods to evade detection while maintaining strict internal discipline and coherence. Investigators had compiled a detailed timeline of the Network S activities, tracing movements, financial transfers, and personnel rotations with painstaking precision. Each phase demonstrated careful planning, with redundancy built into every element. If one corridor was compromised, another had already been prepared. If one operative was removed, a replacement seamlessly assumed the role. The system functioned like clockwork, with every component calibrated to respond to disruptions while maintaining the illusion of inactivity. Analysts noted that the Network S strength lay not in numbers, but in its ability to operate through compartmentalization, ensuring that no single breach could compromise the entirety of the operation. The financial trail, reconstructed over months of analysis, revealed the extent of resources dedicated to sustaining the network. Funds had been routed through decades-old shell companies, offshore accounts, and cryptic transactions disguised as routine business operations. The transfers followed strict intervals, always matching previously established amounts. The money fueled every aspect of the operation: property acquisition, infrastructure modification, material procurement, and the maintenance of personnel under assumed identities. Every transfer, every record had been deliberately crafted to leave minimal traces, making it nearly impossible to link specific transactions to individuals outside the inner ring. At the same time, investigators revisited all known subterranean sites, now understanding the purpose behind each modification and chamber. Laboratories had been disguised as storage rooms, tunnels reinforced to withstand decades of environmental strain, and hidden exits constructed to allow rapid evacuation. Chemical residues were analyzed to reconstruct the operational cycles, revealing that sites had been used intermittently but with precise regularity. Even the smallest detail, an unused ventilation shaft or a rusted latch, carried significance in understanding how the network maintained flexibility while avoiding detection. Structural engineers, chemists, and forensic experts worked in tandem, combining knowledge to decode the purpose of every element, and the results demonstrated a level of sophistication rarely seen outside of classified military programs. The inner ring itself had remained almost entirely invisible. Investigators identified only a small circle of individuals, each with fragmented public histories and extensive gaps in personal records. These people had rotated through multiple identities, always ensuring that any appearance in one location was immediately followed by disappearance and re-emergence elsewhere. The careful management of their identities mirrored the management of physical infrastructure. Every detail monitored, every movement planned, and every risk mitigated. Surveillance suggested that even within the inner circle, direct knowledge of the entire network was limited to a handful of the most senior operatives, while others executed specific tasks without understanding the broader strategy. Evidence suggested that the network's operational philosophy relied as much on psychological manipulation as logistical control. Operatives had been trained to respond to specific cues, to recognize coded symbols, and to follow procedural rules without questioning authority. The symbols painted across the city, once dismissed as mere territorial markings, were now understood as directives for movement, coordination, and timing. Each message served as a link in a chain, activating responses in individuals who understood only their immediate instructions. The design ensured that even if an operative were captured or defected, their knowledge could not compromise the larger operation. The investigators also pieced together a pattern of influence extending into legitimate institutions. Individuals connected to the network had placed themselves strategically within corporations, government offices, and regulatory agencies. This allowed them to monitor potential threats, manipulate reporting systems, and secure legal and bureaucratic cover for activities occurring beyond public view. The combination of physical infrastructure, financial oversight, and strategic placement within institutions had created a protective envelope around the organization, making detection extraordinarily difficult. By the final stage, the task force had synthesized the network's components into a comprehensive operational model. The tunnels, laboratories, and abandoned properties formed a backbone for movement and concealment. The encrypted communications and rotational scheduling provided coordination. The financial and institutional networks ensured longevity and resilience. Even the psychological conditioning of operatives contributed to the system's endurance, guaranteeing adherence to protocol and minimizing risk of exposure. The network's structure revealed an organization that functioned more like a living organism than a criminal enterprise, capable of adaptation, self-preservation, and strategic evolution. Analysts predicted that dismantling the network entirely would require a coordinated, multi-tiered approach combining legal action, structural interventions, financial disruption, and the neutralization of key personnel. The complexity and foresight built into the system meant that no single operation, however decisive, could bring the entire structure down. Each discovery, each recovered document, and each analyzed residue only added clarity to the operational genius of the network, highlighting a pattern of control that had persisted across generations. As the final pieces of evidence were cataloged, the scope and scale of the underground operation were fully apparent. The network had survived in the shadows, carefully orchestrating movement, concealment, and deception. It had infiltrated institutions, manipulated infrastructure, and preserved its continuity through strict internal discipline. Every action, every precaution, every signal had been designed to sustain secrecy and longevity, demonstrating a level of planning and execution that surpassed conventional criminal operations. The city above remained largely unaware of the hidden lattice of control beneath its streets, a silent testament to the meticulous strategy and unyielding precision of the inner ring